Situated in the southeast of Europe, encompassing the Greek and Anatolian peninsulas of the early centuries, was what historians have come to call the Byzantine Empire, although a man of the time may have known it better by its formal title of the East Roman Empire, or simply the Roman Empire, as this expansive domain had owed its beginnings to the division of Rome into the realms of West and East, and despite having for a significant period lost the titular city of Rome as well as being itself both ethnically and culturally Greek, the people of Byzantium through it all maintained the title and fragmental identity of the Romans. In the years leading up to the First Empire's division, the capital had been moved from Rome in Italy to the Greek city of Byzantium, then renamed New Rome, or as it's more commonly known, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. In the following years, the East would see its power rise while that of the West wane. The Valley of Constantinople, being located strategically where Europe met Asia, encouraged greater focus on the region both in places of security and development, which in part contributed to a neglecting of the old now capital of the Western Empire. Decades of abuse and decline would ultimately drive the West to collapse, leaving the Byzantines as the de facto Roman Empire, and while it had seen a rocky inception, it wasn't long before the empire would soon experience a great revitalization under the direction of Emperor Justinian I. Justinian had an ambition of restoring the empire to its total greatness, seeing to a number of reforms, reorganizations, and reacquisitions of lost land. The plan of imperial restoration, though it was taken far, had not been completed by the time of Justinian's passing. His successors in turn were much less successful in fulfilling these plans, as well as managing crises with the same effectiveness of Justinian. Justinian, for example, despite having lost ground in the reconquest of Italy during one of history's deadliest plague outbreaks, would have remobilized and in only the span of a few years taken back the whole of the peninsula, whilst advancing in Iberia as well. However, these territorial gains would soon be lost as his successors took seat. Western domains would not be regained, leaving the empire with only a few minor landholdings which would only diminish over the years, while in the east any efforts which could have gone toward expansion or restabilization were exhausted in regular conflict with the Persians, both being well matched against the other and only wearing each other down as a new threat arose from the south in the form of the Rashidun Caliphate. Islam had been spreading rapidly and presented itself as a new energetic force prepared to overthrow both the Byzantines and the Persians. The majority of Persia would fall to the Caliphate while Byzantium barely held out, losing its vital Egyptian territory and assuring that any hopes of reinvigorating the empire would be slow and far off. See, it's often taken for granted how Byzantium was not merely the lands of Greece and Anatolia, but in good portion also Egypt. The cities of Constantinople in Greece, Antioch in Anatolia, and Alexandria in Egypt formed a golden triangle of historic Greek cities which stood as major hubs of the empire's realms in the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, each contributing a major asset in the fields of commerce, military might, and production of goods respectively, a little bit like how the American colonies were specialized in our world. Egypt had been a key pillar of imperial agriculture and production. With it now in the hands of the Caliphate, the Byzantines would be left running on only 2/3 of their original capabilities, still needing to contend with hostile forces all around them, as well as their own internal stressors. The empire would remain in this dire position until about the year 1000, when it would reclaim a number of its Balkan territories under Basil II, as well as formalize a relationship with the Kievan Rus and reorganize both governing structure and social rank to re-centralize power and avert more authority to the emperor. However, the period would also see new rivals emerge for the empire, not to mention new threats from within the empire itself. The church would be split along eastern and western lines in what would be known as the Great Schism. Byzantine dependency upon foreign mercenaries for military support would make of the imperial army an unruly, inexperienced, and untrustworthy lot, which also took a great financial toll upon the empire. And to make matters worse, Basil II's lack of a proper heir created a crisis of conditions which threatened to undo all the previous emperor had accomplished, and leaving in its wake a long line of subpar leaders. The point at which many agree that the damage dealt to Byzantium was irreversible was following the loss at Manzikert under Emperor Romanos IV. Romanos was betrayed by a rival within his ranks and left exposed to an attack by the Seljuk Turks, who captured him and brought him before Sultan Alp Arslan. Romanos was allowed to go free, but upon his return to Constantinople he was overthrown and blinded, succumbing to his wounds shortly after. In the years following Arslan's own passing, Byzantium would lose Anatolia, the Crusades would be initiated by the Church, and the Ottomans would rise as the new dominant force in the region, absorbing all former Byzantine lands and ending the empire for all times. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate world the Byzantines managed to overcome these tribulations and secure the existence of their empire well into the later centuries? Often it's proposed that had the Byzantines won at Manzikert, the Turks would have been repelled, faith would have been restored in the emperor, and the following centuries would see stabilization return to the land as several incursions would be prevented, including the disastrous Fourth Crusade, which turned the Crusaders against the Byzantines themselves. But several problems would still exist for Byzantium which would need to be accounted for and resolved, primarily rooting out and extinguishing rival claims to the throne, repairing the economic system to both restore confidence from the peasantry while diminishing the threat posed by wealthy nobles, suppressing regional resistance in the Balkans, not to mention securing the east, as well as rebuilding the army from the Byzantine population in place of the inexperienced and disloyal foreign mercenaries currently in use, and on top of all that, revitalize agriculture and production to support the population. Had Romanos won at Manzikert, the chances of all these needs being addressed is still a stretch. Realistically, even in a best-case scenario, we'd likely still see a heavy dependence upon foreign soldiers while the population reinforced itself and incentives were developed to help get Byzantine men back into the ranks. And until that point, several things could go wrong for the empire, including further raids and breakoffs of territory. As a general, Romanos also had ambitions of expanding eastward against the Turks in a conquest of Iraq, Iran, and Syria, something which would no doubt drive the Byzantine army to a breaking point, for a result which would ultimately not last, as just some decades later the Mongols would have charged through the region, forcing the Byzantines to retreat to their fortifications in Anatolia. A better option would have been to forge peace with the Turks and advance southward against the declining Fatimid Caliphate for a recapture of Egyptian land. This could be achieved with much less effort than a western push, and would ultimately speed up Byzantine recovery by opening up access to the region's resources, which had historically helped Byzantium maintain its powerful soldier population. So for the sake of keeping Byzantium standing, we're going to propose that the Byzantines not only win at Manzikert, but soon after establish peace with the Turks and direct forces toward Egypt. Essentially, everything that could realistically go right for the Byzantines at this point just happens to go right. Perhaps Romanos turns out to be an exceptional emperor on par with Justinian or Basil, but whatever the case, somehow Byzantium is able to mend these previously stated issues either immediately or over time. Assuming Romanos lives about as long as Basil or Justinian, his reign would end sometime following the turn of the century, in which time he would have exploited the turbulent situation in Egypt to launch an invasion by land and by sea, securing a foothold in the northeast coast. Hopes of retaking Italian lands would need to be set aside, as western expansion had historically proven detrimental and unstable for the empire. Instead, the Byzantines would cement their domain in the East Mediterranean, building fortifications along its border to secure what would come to be recognized as Byzantium Prime, the essential and necessary homeland of the Byzantines, which encompassed the Greek, Anatolian, and Egyptian coasts. With this restoration both of security and of land, peasants would find greater opportunity as craftsmen, merchants, fishers, and farmers especially, this boom in the farming population granting the empire a wealth of manpower to draw upon for its reformed army, as historically Byzantine soldiers came in large part from the rugged rural lands of Anatolia and Egypt. This in turn would decrease dependence upon mercenaries, reducing imperial spending dramatically, and would allow for the wealth to be reinvested both in the population and in national developments. Once again, we're going to be assuming that all of this goes on without a hitch for the sake of ensuring that the empire not last only a few additional years. In Europe, the Crusades would not be called by the Pope, and instead these would-be crusaders are directed to more local efforts such as the Reconquista and other conflicts throughout the continent. There's also little reason to assume the Renaissance would not occur later on. If impacted at all, it may merely take the form of a minor delay. The contributions of the East to the West during this period are grossly hyperbolized, as much of the components which produced the Renaissance were already present in Europe at this point. Thus, any differences to the Renaissance are likely to be minor, but what this does mean in terms of changes is that Russia and much of Eastern Europe will benefit from technologies which Byzantium would have withheld from the Catholic West. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, as before any of that occurs, the Mongols would still enter the picture, storming the gates of Byzantium in Central Europe, before ultimately fracturing and receding back into the east as in our world. Byzantium would see little expansion during this period of Mongol assault, and especially as the Black Plague dealt its population a major blow. On the upside for them, this maintaining of a Christian presence across the Levantine coast and Egypt would isolate the Muslims of North Africa, leaving them far more vulnerable to retaliation by the Christian kingdoms, especially as Berber piracy became more common, and these pirates now stood without the support of a neighboring Islamic power. Additionally, without the expansion of the Turks into the Balkans, Hungary would likely be left to its own devices both by Byzantium and Austria, while Bulgaria, who would have broken away during the restabilization of the empire, would see steady territorial acquisition in the following years. Because the major gateways of trade are still occupied by a Christian power, there's less incentive for the European nations to pursue a faster route to Asia, and thus accidentally stumble upon the New World. It's doubtful that the Americas would remain undiscovered for long, however, but as was said with the Renaissance, a delay could be expected. The only question is if anything of significance were to change during that delay. By 1500, the major powers of Europe would of course be the Habsburg kingdoms of Iberia and Germany, the Kingdom of France, and the Empire of the Byzantines. Much as in our own world, the French would find themselves in regular competition with the Habsburgs, being sandwiched between two of their realms and having little opportunity for personal expansion, the French would seek out allies wherever they might find them, of course turning to the only alternative, the Byzantine Empire. In our world, this had been the same basis upon which the unorthodox Franco-Ottoman alliance had been established, and in this world would be met with only slightly less controversy as it appeared an apparent betrayal of the Catholic West, but in truth was really only angering the Habsburgs. Because the French pursued territories in Italy, the Byzantines saw this alliance as not only a means to regain a foothold in the West with little personal expense, but also an opening into re-establishing its historic Roman domain through the use of an ally. That, and of course diminishing any threat the Habsburgs might pose in the Mediterranean. Spain itself would have been a more formidable local force in this world, as despite having missed out on the wealth acquired from the American colonies, those resources which would have been otherwise spent maintaining and exploring abroad are kept locally and funneled into national projects and innovations. This, paired with an untapped reserve of soldiers in the Catholic world, would allow it to capture Morocco, thus securing the lucrative western entrance to the Mediterranean and locking the Barbary pirates of North Africa between itself and Byzantium, making it clear that their time would soon be over, and the Mediterranean would once again belong exclusively to the Christian powers. Greater wealth and focus on development within Spain would create an appealing incentive for Portugal to accept the Iberian Union once it comes about, meaning far less resistance to the integration and a gradual Spaniardization of Portuguese land. With Hungary and Poland-Lithuania blocking off access to the east, Austria too would become more internally focused and pursue union with its neighboring German states into an alternate Austrian or rather Germanic empire. Things would follow this pace until the 1600s, when tensions between Western Protestants and Catholics came to a boiling point, most prominently in the Holy Roman Empire, where Austria found itself met with resistance from Protestants in Bohemia over fears of Catholic domination, mimicking the events in our timeline which led to the 30 Years' War. The Byzantines, French, and Russians seeking to exploit this crack in the Habsburgs' armor would support the Protestants in an anti-Habsburg coalition, a move which by the end of the war would have netted each of them notable land acquisitions, in addition to successfully crippling their mutual foes on the European scene, as in addition to the sheer might of this coalition, the Habsburgs had made significant use of New World resources to fund this conflict in our world, resources which would now be out of the picture. And speaking of which, it would be following this war with the emergence of England, the Netherlands, and France as the new European naval powers that the discovery and colonization of the New World would finally begin. While Spain by this point could still throw its hat into the colonial game, its leadership would have been made inept and feeble by generations of inbreeding, yet even if Spain had managed to take any lands for itself at this time, they would no doubt still be lost in the inevitable War of Spanish Succession not far on the horizon. With Spain knocked out of the fight, France and England would be the new dominant forces of the West, the Netherlands desperately vying for England's position as there would have been a tremendous amount of competition between the two at this time. The Dutch, being in a geographically disadvantageous position, would come into an alliance with France against England, the two compromising to divide colonial claim to global land much in the same way Spain and Portugal had in our world. France would allow the Dutch clear access to their ports in exchange for an upholding of their agreement, and a keeping of England from establishing colonies in the Dutch domain. Byzantine colonization for the time would be relatively minimal and focus again on the east. Its colonial holdings would reach down the coast and into the Horn of Africa, branching out into a number of small port colonies to further its trade opportunities. Byzantium's true accomplishment would have been in the proxy victories it would have achieved through funding, supporting, and planning with its allies of France and Russia, the latter of which now being well ahead of the Russia that our world knew thanks to Byzantine collaboration. This also wouldn't be a westernized Russia as had been envisioned by Peter the Great, but one which drew heavily from Byzantine technology and old Greco-Roman culture. France too would have contributed significantly to the advancements of the alliance for the sake of maintaining an edge against England, who itself had been doing a fine job of holding its ground, but may find itself soon overwhelmed by what were the most densely populated, most geographically large, and most wealthy powers on the entire continent. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. You can pick up a copy of our novel, I Am Uncle Sam, in the links below, support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.